The courtroom was filled with tension. People whispered to each other, shifting nervously in their seats. The billionaire sat quietly at the front, his hands gripping the edge of the desk, trying to hide his anxiety. He was facing a case that could change his life forever, and the room seemed to weigh down on him like a heavy cloud. His usually confident expression was gone, replaced by worry and uncertainty. The crowd noticed it too, but no one expected what was about to happen. The lawyer who had been representing the billionaire, someone known for sharp thinking and a long record of winning cases, suddenly stood up. There was a murmur among the crowd as he announced he could no longer continue. A conflict had arisen, he said, and he had no choice but to step away. The billionaire blinked in shock, unable to believe what he had just heard. He felt completely exposed, as if the walls of the courtroom had closed in on him. Panic began to creep into his chest, but he tried to hold it back. He had never faced anything like this before. The people watching were confused and worried. Many whispered to each other about what would happen next. Some shook their heads, thinking the billionaire was doomed. They looked around, expecting someone to help, but there was silence. Everyone waited, unsure what would happen, while the opposing sides smiled quietly, sensing that the case was turning in their favor. Among the crowd, there was a small figure standing at the edge of the room. It was the child of the billionaire's maid. They had been quietly watching everything from the corner, trying not to draw attention. Most people did not notice the child at first, but the child had sharp eyes and a strong sense of what was right. When the lawyer left and the billionaire seemed helpless, the child's heart began to race. They could see the fear in the billionaire's eyes, the way he felt lost and alone. The child could not stand by and do nothing. In that moment, they made a decision. They were going to step forward. Everyone in the courtroom was focused on the billionaire and the empty chair where the lawyer had been. No one was paying attention to the child, who now took a deep breath. Then, suddenly, the child shouted, "I can protect him." The voice rang out loudly, clear and full of determination. The room went silent for a moment. Heads turned, eyes widened, and mouths dropped open. People could not believe that a small child had just spoken up like that. The billionaire froze. He looked at the child with surprise and a hint of hope. Could this really be happening? A child, someone so young, had just declared that they would help him. The opposing side's lawyers exchanged puzzled glances, unsure how to react. They had not expected this at all. The child stepped closer, holding their head high. Their eyes were full of courage, and their small hands trembled slightly, but their voice did not falter. "I know what to do," the child said. "I can protect him. I will not let anyone harm him with lies. I will help." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that no one could ignore. The judge looked over the rim of their glasses, clearly surprised. They had seen many strange things in their career, but this was unusual. A child standing up in a courtroom, claiming they could handle a complicated legal case, was not something that happened every day. Yet, there was something in the child's tone that made the judge pause. It was confidence mixed with honesty, and for some reason it felt real. The crowd began to shift uneasily. Some murmured to each other, wondering if the child could actually do anything. Others felt a spark of curiosity. Could this small, quiet observer actually make a difference? The billionaire, still stunned, felt a tiny glimmer of hope. He had been abandoned, left without a lawyer. But here was someone willing to step forward, someone who seemed fearless despite their young age. The child looked at the billionaire and nodded firmly. "Don't worry," they said softly but firmly. "I will help you. You are not alone. I am here, and I will protect you." The billionaire's chest tightened. He did not know what to say. He wanted to thank the child, but words failed him. Instead, he simply nodded, trying to convey his gratitude. For a moment, the entire courtroom was still. People watched closely as the child walked towards the front. The child's small figure seemed fragile, but the determination in their eyes was stronger than anything anyone had expected. Even the opposing lawyers were unsure how to respond. They had thought this would be an easy win, that the billionaire would be left defenseless. But now everything had changed. The child began to speak carefully and clearly. They asked questions, pointed out details, and reminded the judge of facts that had been overlooked. Each sentence was simple, but it had meaning and power. The child's voice was calm but commanding, and slowly, the room began to quiet down. People leaned forward, curious to hear what the child would say next. The billionaire's heart swelled with hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, he might still have a chance. The child's bravery inspired others. Witnesses who had been nervous began to pay closer attention. Lawyers who had been confident started to second-guess themselves. The judge, initially skeptical, found themselves listening carefully to each word the child spoke. Something about the child's honesty and courage made it hard to dismiss them. As the first part of the courtroom drama unfolded, it became clear that this was no ordinary situation. The billionaire, once abandoned and vulnerable, had a small, unexpected hero by his side. And the child, who had only intended to protect someone they cared about, was about to change the course of the entire case. The room, once heavy with tension, now held a sense of anticipation. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next, and no one could predict the full impact of the child's bold declaration. By the end of the day, one thing was certain. Courage does not depend on age, and heroes can come from the most unexpected places. The child had taken the first step, and the story of bravery, determination, and justice had just begun. No one in the courtroom would forget the moment when a small voice shouted, "I can protect him," and turned fear into hope for everyone present. The courtroom had gone completely quiet. All eyes were on the child who had just declared they would protect the billionaire. The child's small figure stood firm, and their voice, though soft, carried an unexpected authority. The billionaire looked at them, a mix of amazement and hope filling his eyes. He had been left alone and helpless, but somehow, this young, observant child seemed ready to step in. The child began moving carefully around the courtroom, paying attention to the papers, the witnesses, and even the subtle reactions of the lawyers on the other side. Every gesture, every glance, every small detail mattered. They had spent years watching the world quietly from the sidelines, observing people's actions and learning to notice patterns. Now, all that quiet observation was about to make a real difference. They approached the front and quietly asked the judge if they could speak. The judge, still surprised, nodded slowly. This was unusual, but there was something in the child's demeanor that made the judge think it was worth listening. The child took a deep breath, steadying themselves, and then began to speak. Their words were simple but precise, pointing out facts that had been overlooked by the adults in the room. They reminded the judge of important details, mentioned documents that were being ignored, and asked clear questions that made the witnesses pause and think. The opposing lawyers exchanged glances, clearly puzzled. They had not anticipated this. They had expected a weak and nervous billionaire, not a confident child who could notice gaps in their strategy. The child's voice was calm, but the way they spoke made it hard for anyone to ignore them. It was as if the child could see through the confusion and bring clarity where others had failed. The billionaire watched in amazement as the child moved from point to point, explaining what needed to be noticed. He could hardly believe that someone so young could understand so much. It was not just courage that impressed him. It was insight. The child noticed small contradictions in statements, subtle mistakes in the way evidence had been presented, and even the way witnesses hesitated when questioned. Each observation added weight to their argument. The witnesses themselves began to feel the pressure. They could see that the child was serious and thoughtful, and they could not ignore the simple truth in their observations. One by one, they started to respond more carefully, answering questions with more honesty and clarity. The opposing side's lawyers tried to regain control, but it was not easy. The child had already begun to shift the momentum in favor of the billionaire. The judge, initially skeptical, leaned forward in their chair. They had been surprised by the child's presence and doubtful of their abilities, but now they were genuinely listening. Each point the child made was relevant and insightful. It was clear that this was not random chatter. It was careful reasoning and a deep sense of fairness. The courtroom, once filled with tension and anxiety, began to feel a sense of focus and clarity. People in the audience were equally captivated. Some whispered to each other, amazed at what was happening. Others felt inspired by the child's bravery. They realized courage and intelligence could come in small packages, and that someone who might be underestimated could actually make a huge difference. The child's actions were quietly teaching everyone a lesson. Never judge someone by their age or size. The child continued to speak, moving gently between the witnesses and the papers on the table. Each statement they made was supported by careful observation and thoughtful reasoning. The billionaire began to lean forward, listening closely, realizing that this child could actually help him. He felt a spark of hope he had not felt since his lawyer had left him. The child had not just promised to protect him, they were already doing it. The opposing lawyers tried to challenge the child, asking questions meant to confuse or intimidate them. But the child remained calm. They listened carefully, thought for a moment, and answered each question honestly and clearly. The way they spoke was different from the adults. There was no arrogance, no pretense, just honesty and courage. The courtroom was mesmerized. Even the most skeptical members of the audience could not help but pay attention. As the session went on, the child noticed another problem in the evidence being presented against the billionaire. A key document had been misread, and an important detail had been overlooked. The child quickly pointed it out, explaining it in simple, clear terms that everyone could understand. The judge nodded, appreciating the clarity, and the billionaire's confidence grew. He had gone from feeling abandoned to feeling supported, and all it had taken was a small voice with a big heart. The child did not stop there. They asked thoughtful questions of the witnesses on the other side, revealing inconsistencies in their statements. The opposing lawyers tried to respond, but each time, the child's careful observation and clear explanation made it difficult for them to hide the truth. The energy in the courtroom shifted. What had started as a desperate situation for the billionaire was slowly turning into an opportunity. The child's bravery and intelligence were changing the outcome. The billionaire could not stop watching the child. He felt a mix of admiration and gratitude. This was not just a young person speaking out, they were strategizing, protecting, and guiding him in a situation he had thought he could not survive. It was as if the child had stepped into the role of a guardian, someone who could see the truth and fight for it without fear. People in the audience began to lean forward in their seats, captivated by what they were witnessing. The child's courage was contagious. Adults who had been skeptical were now intrigued and inspired. The courtroom felt different. It was no longer just a place of tension and anxiety. It was a space where justice and courage were coming alive in the most unexpected way. The child continued to explain points, always returning to the main goal, protecting the billionaire and making sure the truth was heard. They were careful not to overstep, but they were also unafraid. Their small size and young age did not matter. Their heart and mind were bigger than anyone had expected. Each observation, each question, and each clarification moved the case closer to fairness. By the end of the day, the courtroom had been transformed. The child had become the unexpected center of attention, and the billionaire felt hope for the first time since his lawyer had left. He knew that the child had saved him from a moment of complete helplessness. People would talk about this day for a long time, not just because of the legal case, but because of the courage, intelligence, and determination of one small person who refused to stay silent. The child returned to the edge of the room for a moment, taking a deep breath. They had made a difference today, and they knew there was more to do. But they also felt proud. They had faced a room full of adults, a difficult situation, and they had not backed down. They had spoken the truth, observed carefully, and protected someone who needed help. In that moment, the child realized that courage and intelligence could overcome fear, and that even the smallest voices could change the world. The billionaire looked at the child, his eyes full of gratitude. He could not find the words to express what he felt. It was more than thanks. It was respect, awe, and relief. He had been abandoned by someone he trusted, but he had gained a hero he had never expected. And the child, standing quietly, knew that this was just the beginning of their journey together. They had taken the first steps in a story that was far from over, and the world around them would never forget the courage they had shown. The courtroom was alive with tension, but this time, it felt different. There was a sense of focus, a sense of attention on the child who had now become the center of the story. The child had stepped up not just as an observer but as someone actively helping the billionaire. Every word they spoke carried weight, and everyone in the room, from the judge to the audience, was paying close attention. The billionaire could hardly believe it. He had gone from panic and fear to hope and trust in this small, unexpected ally. The child began to notice something others had missed. They looked carefully at the evidence on the table, flipping through pages, reading every line with attention and care. There were mistakes, oversights, and contradictions that even the most experienced adults had overlooked. The child pointed them out gently but firmly, making sure the judge and the audience could understand. Each time they spoke, the room shifted slightly. People leaned forward, eager to hear the next observation. The opposing lawyers were visibly unsettled. They had expected an easy path to victory after the billionaire's lawyer had abandoned him. But now, a small child was questioning their evidence, noticing mistakes, and asking sharp questions. They tried to regain control, but it was not easy. The child's clarity and courage made it difficult for them to continue their usual strategies. They had underestimated the child completely, and it was becoming clear that they could not ignore this unexpected force. Witnesses, too, began to feel the pressure. The child asked questions that were simple yet insightful, revealing inconsistencies in their statements. Each question made the witnesses pause and think carefully before answering. They could not lie easily under the child's careful attention. It was not just about knowledge. It was about honesty, courage, and the power of careful observation. The child had a way of asking questions that felt direct but fair, and it forced everyone to consider the truth. The billionaire watched in amazement as the child moved from point to point, calmly and clearly addressing issues that had seemed impossible to handle without a professional lawyer. He felt a mix of relief and admiration. This child, who had been quietly observing for so long, had now taken charge in a way no one could have predicted. The billionaire realized that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places, and that courage can appear in the smallest forms. The judge, who had been skeptical at first, now listened closely to the child's words. Each point was clear, logical, and easy to understand. The judge could not ignore the insight and honesty in the child's statements. Slowly, the courtroom's energy began to shift. What had started as fear and tension was now turning into careful attention and respect. The child's presence was changing the atmosphere completely. People in the audience whispered excitedly among themselves. They were witnessing something extraordinary. A small child, who most had ignored at the start, was now influencing the course of a high-stakes legal case. They realized that bravery, intelligence, and honesty were far more important than age or experience. The child's actions were inspiring everyone, reminding them that courage can come from anywhere and anyone. The child noticed another critical issue in the evidence. A document had been misinterpreted, and a crucial detail had been missed by both sides. The child quickly pointed it out, explaining it in simple terms so everyone could understand. The opposing lawyers tried to argue, but the child calmly provided evidence to support their point. Each time, the child's observations were accurate and relevant, leaving little room for doubt. The billionaire felt a wave of gratitude. He had never imagined that a child could understand so much and speak with such clarity and courage. He could see that the child was not only protecting him but also guiding him through a complex and dangerous situation. It was as if the child had an innate understanding of people and truth, and could see through the confusion that had clouded the courtroom for so long. As the session continued, the child asked the witnesses on the opposing side more questions, carefully exposing inconsistencies and mistakes. Their observations were simple yet profound, highlighting facts that adults had missed. The child's approach was different from typical lawyers. There was no pretense, no arrogance, only honesty and courage. The audience was captivated, and even the opposing side began to doubt their confidence. The child had started to turn the tide. The billionaire, sitting quietly, felt a sense of awe and relief. He had been abandoned by his lawyer and left alone in a complex situation, But this child had stepped in and taken charge. The child's courage and intelligence were now guiding him through the storm. He realized that help and hope could appear when least expected, and that courage was not limited to adults or professionals. The child moved carefully, making sure that every point they made was understood. They were precise, thoughtful, and careful not to overstep. Yet their impact was undeniable. The judge took careful notes, the witnesses answered more honestly, and the audience was fully engaged. The opposing lawyers struggled to maintain control, realizing that the child had shifted the momentum in a surprising and unexpected way. The child's small voice now carried a big presence in the courtroom. Each statement they made was met with attention and thought. They pointed out details, asked insightful questions, and reminded everyone of the importance of truth and fairness. Their courage and intelligence were becoming the center of the story, proving that even the smallest voices can have the greatest impact. The billionaire felt a sense of hope he had not experienced since the lawyer had left. This child, whom he had never expected to play a significant role, had already started to change the course of his case. He felt protected, guided, and inspired. The child's presence had brought clarity and focus to a situation that had seemed hopeless. The courtroom was alive with a new energy. People leaned forward, eager to hear the child's next observation. The child remained calm and focused, carefully considering each point and speaking with honesty and courage. The opposing side, once confident, was now cautious, realizing that the child's insight could not be dismissed. The room had transformed from a place of tension and uncertainty into a space where truth and courage were taking center stage. By the end of the session, the child had made a remarkable impact. They had identified mistakes, asked sharp questions, and helped the billionaire regain his sense of hope and control. The audience, witnesses, and even the judge could not ignore the difference this small person had made. The child had turned a moment of fear into a moment of courage and clarity. The billionaire looked at the child with deep gratitude. He could not find the words to express his feelings. The child had done more than protect him. They had guided him, inspired him, and reminded everyone that courage and intelligence could come from the most unexpected places. The child, standing quietly, felt proud. They had stepped into a difficult situation and made a real difference. The story was far from over, but the child had already proven that even the smallest voice could change the course of events and bring hope to those who needed it most. The courtroom had shifted from a place of tension and fear into a place of attention and surprise. The child who had bravely stepped forward now commanded the focus of everyone present. The billionaire, who had been abandoned and vulnerable, was now watching with hope as the child calmly moved among the papers and witnesses, pointing out details no one else had noticed. Every movement of the child's small hands seemed to carry purpose, and every word spoken had a quiet power that filled the room. The child's eyes scanned the documents carefully, noticing subtle contradictions and overlooked facts. Each time they spoke, the judge leaned closer, following every detail. Even the opposing lawyers, who had started the day with confidence, found themselves questioning their approach. They had underestimated the child completely, and now they were realizing that this was no ordinary observer. The child's reasoning was clear, their observations precise, and their courage unshakable. The witnesses on the opposing side felt a growing pressure. The child asked simple yet sharp questions that made them pause and rethink their answers. There was no room to hide the truth, no space for false statements. The child had a way of asking questions that made honesty feel necessary. Slowly, the room began to notice that the child's small voice was making a big difference. Each careful observation, each question, shifted the momentum in favor of the billionaire. The billionaire sat quietly, amazed by the child's ability to navigate the complex courtroom situation. He had gone from panic to relief in a matter of hours, all because of this brave, intelligent young observer. The child had not only noticed what adults missed, but they had also spoken up with a confidence that inspired everyone around them. It was as if the child had a natural sense of fairness and truth, a clarity that adults often lost in the rush of their work. As the session continued, the child spotted another critical issue. An important witness had made a small mistake in their testimony, a detail that could have gone unnoticed, but had serious implications for the case. The child spoke up, gently but firmly pointing out the error. The judge nodded, clearly appreciating the clarity of the explanation, and the audience leaned in, fascinated by how much one small person could influence such a high-stakes situation. The opposing lawyers tried to regain control, asking complex questions and attempting to challenge the child's observations. But the child remained calm. They listened carefully, thought for a moment, and responded with honesty and clarity. Each answer was simple yet powerful, and it was impossible for anyone to dismiss the child's insight. The room was captivated. Adults who had doubted the child now had to acknowledge the sharp mind and brave heart that stood before them. The audience began to murmur quietly, sharing their amazement with one another. They watched as the child moved confidently, asking questions, pointing out mistakes, and ensuring that every fact was considered. The billionaire's hope grew with each passing moment. He realized that the child's courage had not only protected him but also guided the entire case toward fairness. The courtroom, once tense and uncertain, now felt a sense of order and justice emerging. The child approached the witnesses on the opposing side again, asking questions that revealed small but important inconsistencies. Each question was thoughtful and carefully framed, forcing the witnesses to think carefully before answering. The opposing lawyers tried to interrupt, but the child's calm determination made it clear that their role was to seek truth and fairness. The courtroom energy shifted further. What had seemed like an impossible situation was now turning in favor of the billionaire. The billionaire could hardly believe what he was seeing. He had been left helpless and worried, but now, a small figure was taking charge in a way he could never have imagined. The child was not only observing but also guiding him through the legal battle, offering insights and helping him navigate the complexity of the case. Every word, every action of the child made a difference, and he felt a growing sense of trust and gratitude. The judge, too, was fully engaged. They listened carefully to every word the child spoke, noting the relevance and accuracy of the observations. It was clear that the child was not just speaking without reason. Every statement was backed by careful thought and observation. The courtroom atmosphere had changed completely. The fear and tension of the morning had given way to focus, clarity, and hope. The child's small voice continued to carry authority. They reminded everyone in the room of the facts, clarified points that had been misunderstood, and gently questioned assumptions. The billionaire watched in awe, realizing that this child had brought a sense of order and fairness that had been missing. It was as if the child had stepped into a role that no adult could fill, combining courage, intelligence, and honesty in a way that commanded respect. The witnesses continued to respond carefully, influenced by the child's careful questioning. The opposing lawyers were forced to reconsider their arguments, unable to ignore the clarity and insight the child had brought to the case. The audience was captivated, leaning forward to see what the child would notice next. It was clear that the small voice that had shouted, "I can protect him," was now shaping the outcome of the case in ways no one could have predicted. The child spotted another overlooked detail in the evidence. A document had been misread, a crucial point that could change the direction of the case. The child pointed it out, explaining in simple terms so that everyone could understand. The judge nodded, acknowledging the importance of the observation, and the billionaire felt hope rising in his chest. The child had not just spoken. They had acted, analyzed, and protected, turning the tides in a way that adults had failed to do. By the end of the day, it was clear that the child had become the unexpected hero of the courtroom. Their courage, intelligence, and honesty had transformed a situation that seemed hopeless into one filled with potential and hope. The billionaire, who had been abandoned and vulnerable, now had an ally he could trust completely. The courtroom had witnessed something extraordinary. A small person standing up for truth and fairness, guiding the course of events with a heart full of courage. The child stood quietly for a moment, taking a deep breath. They had made a real difference today, but they knew that the journey was not over. The billionaire looked at them with deep gratitude, knowing that he owed his hope and protection to this young, brave observer. The courtroom, once tense and uncertain, had been changed by the power of courage, honesty, and determination. The story of the child's bravery would be remembered, not just for what they did, but for the hope and clarity they brought to a moment of fear and uncertainty. The final day of the courtroom battle had arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. The room was filled with people who had been following the case closely, curious to see how it would end. The billionaire, who had been abandoned by his lawyer, sat nervously at the front, but there was a spark of hope in his eyes. He had watched the child's courage and intelligence over the last few days, and he knew that this young person had already changed the course of the case. Today, everything would come together. The child, small but determined, stood ready once again. They had spent hours reviewing the evidence, observing the witnesses, and thinking carefully about the best way to present their points. Each word they spoke in the courtroom had carried weight, and now, everyone waited to see the final outcome. The child took a deep breath and stepped forward, their eyes focused and clear. The opposing lawyers looked tense. They had tried to regain control in the previous sessions, but each time, the child had responded with clarity and confidence that left them unable to continue their usual tactics. They now realized that this was not a normal situation. They faced a small, brave person who had already challenged their assumptions and uncovered critical details they had missed. The child began speaking, calmly and clearly, summarizing the key points that had been uncovered over the course of the trial. They pointed out inconsistencies in the opposing side's arguments, highlighted overlooked evidence, and asked questions that forced the witnesses to admit truths they had tried to hide. Each statement was simple, honest, and precise, but together they created a powerful impact. The courtroom was silent, hanging on every word. The billionaire watched in awe. He had been abandoned and felt powerless, but this child had become his guiding force. The child's ability to observe, analyze, and speak with courage had turned the entire situation around. He realized that he owed not just his hope, but perhaps even his future, to this small, determined ally. The child's courage had protected him when he had no one else to rely on. The judge, who had been skeptical at first, now listened intently. Each point the child made was relevant and accurate. The judge could see that the child's reasoning was logical and fair, and they were careful to consider every statement. Slowly, the tide of the case was shifting in favor of the billionaire. What had once seemed impossible was now within reach. Witnesses on the opposing side were visibly nervous. The child's careful questioning had revealed inconsistencies and mistakes that were difficult to explain. The child asked each question with calm authority, never raising their voice but making sure the truth could not be hidden. Each answer from the witnesses seemed to strengthen the billionaire's position and weaken the opposing case. The audience was captivated. People whispered among themselves, amazed that such a young person could have such a profound impact on a complex legal situation. They realized that bravery, honesty, and careful observation were more powerful than age or experience. The child's actions were a reminder that even the smallest voice could make the biggest difference when guided by courage and truth. The child noticed one final critical point. A piece of evidence that had been overlooked could change the outcome of the case completely. With careful words, the child pointed out the detail, explaining it so clearly that everyone could understand its importance. The judge nodded, recognizing the significance of the observation, and the opposing lawyers were left scrambling for answers. The child had seen something that no adult had noticed, and it could decide the outcome. The billionaire felt his heart swell with gratitude. This child had stepped up when no one else would, protecting him, guiding him, and helping him fight for justice. The child's courage and intelligence had turned a desperate situation into an opportunity for fairness. He realized that the child's actions were not just helping him. They were teaching everyone present a lesson about honesty, courage, and the power of determination. The judge called for a final review of the evidence. The child stood confidently, summarizing the key points once more. Each statement reinforced the truth, clarified misunderstandings, and highlighted the importance of fairness. The opposing side had no choice but to acknowledge the accuracy of the child's observations. It was clear that the case had been shaped significantly by this brave, observant young person. As the judge began to speak, the room was tense. Everyone waited to hear the final decision. The child held their breath slightly, knowing they had done everything they could. The billionaire sat forward, feeling a mix of nervousness and hope. The judge's words finally came, and the ruling was in favor of the billionaire. The courtroom erupted in quiet murmurs of surprise and relief. The child had helped secure justice. The billionaire looked at the child, overwhelmed with gratitude. He wanted to thank them, but words were not enough. The child had done more than protect him. They had guided the case, uncovered the truth, and given him hope when he had felt abandoned. The judge acknowledged the child's role, noting the bravery, intelligence, and determination that had made a difference. The courtroom had witnessed something extraordinary, and everyone present knew it. The child returned to the edge of the room, taking a deep breath. They had faced a room full of adults, navigated a complex legal situation, and made a real difference. Their courage had inspired not only the billionaire but everyone in the courtroom. The story of their bravery would be remembered for years to come. The audience, witnesses, and lawyers had all learned a valuable lesson. Courage, honesty, and careful observation could change the course of events, no matter one's age. The billionaire finally stood and approached the child. With a warm and heartfelt expression, he expressed his gratitude. He knew that this young hero had changed his life and ensured justice was served. The child smiled quietly, feeling proud but calm. They had acted with courage and honesty, and the result was more important than any praise. Their bravery had made a difference, and that was what mattered most. The courtroom slowly began to empty, but the impact of the day lingered in everyone's minds. The child had shown that true courage was not about size or age. It was about heart, determination, and the willingness to stand up for what was right. The billionaire left with a sense of relief and gratitude, knowing that he had been protected and guided when he needed it most. Outside the courtroom, the child and the billionaire shared a quiet moment. The world had seen their bravery, and the child had proven that even the smallest voice could carry great power. They had faced fear, uncertainty, and skepticism, yet they had remained focused on the truth and fairness. Their actions would inspire others to believe in courage, honesty, and the importance of standing up for what is right. The child had not only saved the billionaire but had also left a lasting impression on everyone who had witnessed the events. Their bravery had transformed a tense and desperate situation into a story of hope, courage, and justice. The courtroom, once filled with fear and uncertainty, now carried a sense of respect and admiration for the young hero who had shown that determination, honesty, and courage can change the course of any story, no matter how impossible it may seem.